Testing 1, 2, 3, Part 2 by Humongous. What, wondered government, military, and scientific officials, would happen to humans exposed to enormous amounts of radioactive fallout? How much could a person take? What were unsafe levels? The only way to answer these questions was to test nuclear weapons on living humans, even if they were your own countrymen. The hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers, like John Smitherman, secretly used as lab rats by their own government, also included servicemen termed cloud samplers. Such unfortunate souls were tasked with flying planes through the stems of radioactive mushroom clouds, minutes following nuclear tests, in order to take fallout readings. Imagine being provided a lead pullover suit, weighing 60 pounds, antiquated recording technology, even more primitive flying vehicles, and told to circle inside a glowing red stem of fallout. That's the situation Langdon Harrison and numerous other pilots found themselves in during the 50s and early 60s. Geiger counters soared, needles in the red, as these ignorant airmen were ordered to fly within columns of lethality, engulfed by death. Harrison, a victim of bladder cancer as well as prostate, asserts he would not have subjected himself to such a treacherous environment had he been told the truth. Quote, "The whole thing was fraught with peril and danger, and they, the U.S. government, knew it was. And this I resent quite readily." Unquote. So sick were the military in their attempts to determine fallout effects, they forced pilots of these flights to run their hands alongside planes that had just landed after buzzing inside mushroom clouds. Just as atrocious, airmen of these missions were ordered to swallow film packets attached to strings to determine if levels of radioactivity ingested by pilots were congruent with that externally endured. During atomic tests, U.S. troops were initially positioned 7 miles from ground zero. At this unsafe distance, effects on the men were recorded. Said gap was eventually reduced to 4 miles, as government wanted soldiers as close to blasts as possible to precisely evaluate physical and psychological results. Eventually, servicemen were stationed less than a mile from detonations. Shortly after trials of this nature, hundreds of thousands of these troops in aggregate were forced into the decimated region where they participated in mock war games. We're talking an area so highly irradiated, it remains one of the last places on Earth anybody would want to be. The U.S. government determined the public, as well as soldiers, were too fearful of atomic and thermonuclear weapons. As a result, popular opinion could eventually change to condemnation of the bombs. Since the military had a hard-on for building these nightmares, their solution was to march soldiers through ground zero, knowing full well cancers caused as such might not surface for decades. Consequently, servicemen and the populace would be falsely satisfied there was nothing to fear from radioactivity, and nuclear trials could continue unabated. Even before guinea pig testing of this nature, the U.S. military determined, quote, "Radiologic protection measures, the use of sensitive detection devices, gas masks, disposable clothing, commonly used at prior tests, did more to frighten the participants than to reassure them." Unquote. In short, let's not provide our own soldiers protective clothing nor gear, even though we're sending them into an environment deadlier than a wolf's den should they be bloody rabbits. The Department of Defense denied countless soldiers compensation for cancers contracted due to experiments conducted on them. This was accomplished by simply refusing to pay United States veterans claiming to be suffering from diseases caused by nuclear weapons testing. Jamie Weaver's blindness at birth never had a chance to be remedied. Why? Jamie's mother Brenda asserts her daughter has, quote, eyelashes and eyelids and tear ducts, but no eyes, unquote. Brenda and Jamie lived the majority of their lives in a region known as Death Mile. Best of luck finding a timeshare condo here, as this area rests downwind of the Hanford Engineer Works in Hanford, Washington. It was at this facility plutonium used in nuclear weapons was created. Nearly everyone in this community is suffering from some form of cancer or grim health ailment. At 14 years old, Brenda herself had one of her ovaries extracted. One day, her brother's eyes simply began bleeding profusely. It wasn't uncommon for sheep on Brenda's family farm to be born minus legs, or essential body parts. Edith Schultz Charlton wasn't really sick, but the government decided it was necessary to inject her with 4.9 micrograms of plutonium. This dose equates to 66 times what the average individual endures per year. Ida was a hypochondriac. The fact she wasn't mortally ill was kept secret from her family for decades. Such was typical when it came to human guinea pigs given plutonium or uranium, during the U.S.'s dash to determine the lethality of their newfound elements of destruction. At the time of her injection, Ida wasn't asked for consent, and solely discovered she'd been an experiment decades later. This was the case with Elmer Allen, whose left leg was pierced with plutonium by duplicitous doctors and amputated 3 days later when he'd quote-unquote mysteriously contracted an oddly aggressive form of bone cancer. One moment, Mary Jean Connell was being escorted through an animal research lab. The next, she awoke strapped to a gurney. Around her worked numerous physicians, one of whom was having difficulty opening a clear ampule filled with orange fluid. The other doctors appeared scared of what was in the vial. Moments later, Mary comprehended why. Out of frustration, the physician cracked the tiny container against a table, and a sample of fluid spilled to the floor. Whatever was in the bulb now burnt a hole through the tile. In horror, Mary watched as the remainder of the solution was injected into her veins. The helpless woman exclaimed the sensation was like, quote, laying on hot coals, unquote. The substance introduced into Mary's system was enriched uranium, 584 micrograms of it, double the dose scientists believe would result in kidney damage. Connell, who suffered a myriad of maladies subsequent, asserted post-injection electronics at her work would often fail when she was in their proximity. I feel hurt and humiliated, asserts Mary, who was never asked for consent regarding the experiment. The doctors were probably saying to themselves, well, she isn't much good for anything. If she dies, so what? Many of these individuals, alleged to be suffering from terminal maladies, were misdiagnosed as a scapegoat. Should doctors be questioned why they were pumping patients full of lethal radioisotopes, they could blame their actions on quote-unquote admirable attempts to cure life-threatening illnesses. Good morning, sunshine. Operation Sunshine, that is. Sounds pleasant, doesn't it? In reality, it was a slasher flick complete with desecration of corpses. Even when it comes to body snatching, the United States refuses to be outdone. Think Australia had a monopoly on destruction of the deceased? Think again. Operation Sunshine was responsible for collection and decimation of some 9,000 human bones and almost 600 fetuses. Similar surreptitious schemes in total made use of over 15,000 dead Americans for their purpose. What were 6 scientists engaging in this project seeking? the amount of damage they'd inflicted upon the human population with the nukes they'd been detonating. Cover stories were created by these demented doctors, and families were rarely, if ever, informed their dead loved ones were being hacked up. Thus, the US government was successful in keeping their grave robbing a secret from the populace. In his quest to purloin more cadavers, William Libby, an Atomic Energy Commission administrator, stated, quote, "If anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country," unquote. So cold were scientists comprising Operation Sunshine, they often mused about how many nuclear devices it would take to annihilate Homo sapiens completely. Thanks to the governments of humanity, we're all guinea pigs in regard to atomic and nuclear testing. Each one of us has fallout in our bodies from the thousands of weapons trials conducted. Our species is being forced to live with nuclear power plants that continuously leak into the environment. Nuclear waste, for which humans have no long-term storage solution, is ubiquitous. Just watch the movie Uranium. Is it a country? During which the narrator drives alongside a toxic waste truck on the highway, and his Geiger counter screams out of control. What are we to make of perhaps 2 million American civilians experimented on using radium-tipped rods, after complaining of disorders as mundane as earaches? We're talking a quote-unquote treatment so detrimental it could potentially cause cancer in a prodigious portion of those unwittingly provided this quote-unquote remedy. Cherie Anderson, who endured such drastic procedures, contracted polio by 8 years of age. At 22, she had a pair of tumors extracted from her breasts. Her red blood cells are nowhere near normal, and she currently has nodules on her thyroid. By the age of 41, all but a few of her teeth had disappeared. Realize the United States government has, without your consent, detonated 204 more atomic and nuclear weapons than it informed the public of. In addition, the same hegemony flooded a creek in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with almost 750,000 pounds of mercury. On top of this, the U.S. purposely deluged pastures in Idaho with radioactive iodine. Cows were corralled into these meadows, where they grazed upon the hot grain. These animals were then milked, and civilians unknowingly drank this product. Between 1961 and 1963, cesium and strontium radioisotopes were fed to 102 subjects at the University of Chicago as a test. Radioactive fish was given individuals at the Hanford Engineer Works. At Los Alamos, New Mexico, 57 employees ate tiny globules possessing uranium-235 and manganese-54. Apart from starting thermonuclear war, you could not covertly irradiate humanity more than the above examples elucidate without being caught. So when do we, as a species, cry out, "Enough is enough," and eradicate our belief in this non-existent entity known as government before it eradicates us?